Before Edwina Mountbatten became a scandal, she was a child trained to disappear beautifully. That was the part society never knew what to do with. It remembered the jewels, the yachts, the lovers, the parties that seemed to last until morning, the unconventional marriage people whispered about but rarely understood, the letters from Jawaharlal Nehru, and the last viceroy walking through the final days of empire. It remembered the woman who would not stay where etiquette placed her. It remembered scandal, because scandal was easier to repeat than loneliness, easier to sell than service, easier to understand than a privileged woman who stopped behaving like a decorative wife. Edwina Mountbatten was born into almost everything a girl was told to want: money, name, houses, servants, travel. Dresses chosen before she understood what she liked. Rooms where powerful men lowered their voices and women learned to smile at the right moment. From the outside, her childhood looked like a promise. But inside that promise was a wound. Wealth surrounded her, but it did not hold her. Status opened doors, but it did not give her a home. She would spend much of her life moving from room to room, country to country, man to man, duty to duty, as if movement could solve what stillness made unbearable. She was born Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley in London in 1901. Her world was made from old aristocratic polish and new financial force. Her father, Wilfred Ashley, belonged to the political and landed world of Britain. Her mother, Maud Castle, came from another kind of power, the fortune of Sir Ernest Castle, one of the great financiers of his age. Cassell had not simply inherited importance. He had built it. Born outside the easy center of English aristocracy, marked by foreignness and Jewish ancestry, in a society that remembered such things even when it smiled, he learned early that wealth could buy entry, but not innocence. He moved close to kings, advised powerful men, and gathered a fortune large enough to make his granddaughter one of the richest young women of her generation. But money could not give Edwina what she needed most. Her mother was delicate, often absent, and slowly disappearing into illness. Maud's tuberculosis turned Edwina's childhood into a sequence of waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for visits, waiting for her mother to come home strong enough to stay, waiting for affection to become something more than a letter, a gift, a brief embrace, a promise that would not be kept by the body. The adults around her managed illness, the way their class managed everything painful, with restraint, travel, doctors, silence, and careful language. A child could sense the fear, but was rarely invited to name it. Edwina learned to be good. That was her first survival skill. She wrote careful letters, behaved politely, watched the adults for signs of approval, and tried to become the kind of daughter no one would leave. But good behavior could not cure disease. Obedience could not hold a mother in place. A child may believe that love is earned by being easy, quiet, charming, helpful, perfectly dressed, and never too much trouble. Edwina absorbed that lesson before she had the language to question it. The one person who truly seemed to see her was Sir Ernest Castle. Her grandfather loved her with a seriousness that cut through the formal world around them. He sent animals, gifts, letters, attention. He asked about the things that mattered to her. He watched her health, her riding, her moods, the small private details of a child who was otherwise being trained for public display. With him, Edwina was not simply an heiress in preparation. She was known, That difference would haunt her. Once a child has felt real in one person's eyes, the loss of that gaze can become a lifelong hunger. When Maud died in 1911, Edwina was still a child. The death was not only a bereavement, it was a confirmation of the fear she had been living inside. Love could vanish even when you behaved well. The funeral and the household grief belonged to adults. Edwina was left with routine, duty, and the quiet expectation that sorrow should be handled with dignity. No one taught her how to grieve. They taught her how to continue. That difference shaped everything. After her mother's death, her father retreated into work, politics, society, and his own sadness. Edwina and her younger sister Mary were cared for, instructed, moved through houses and schools. But care is not always intimacy. Edwina became practiced at watching. She watched what adults rewarded. She watched what they ignored. She watched how women could be praised for beauty and punished for need. She watched how grief was folded away like a dress that could not be worn in public. She learned that to be loved, she must be pleasing. To survive, she must be adaptable. To matter, she must become useful to someone. Then came the stepmother, the governesses, the schools, and the training of a girl whose future was supposed to be ornamental. There were lessons, household skills, manners, music, languages, supervised travel, and the strange aristocratic education of becoming a woman who could manage servants without being seen to work. Edwina learned how to move through the world with poise, but not how to rest inside herself. She could be dressed for every occasion. She could be instructed in every surface, but no one seemed able to teach her how to feel safe. As a teenager, travel opened something in her. Paris, Rome, the Ritz, shops, galleries, palaces, cafes, young men, cigarettes, laughter, photographs. The first taste of attention that was not family duty. She was still young, still watched, still chaperoned. But she began to understand that being seen could be used as power. She learned how to enter a room and change its temperature. She learned that charm could become a shield. She learned that if people were going to look at her, she could decide which version of herself they saw. This was not freedom yet. It was rehearsal. By the time Edwina came out into society, the newspapers saw fortune. Hostesses saw opportunity. Suitors saw access. The public saw the rich young beauty. Almost no one saw the child who had once written letters to a dying mother and wondered what she had done wrong. That is the cruelty of gilded lives. The brighter the surface, the less permission anyone gives the wound underneath. She was introduced into a world where young women were appraised with brutal gentleness. Lineage, money, appearance, behavior, marriage prospects. Everything counted. Intelligence helped only if it did not disturb the room. Sorrow was acceptable only when it made a woman more graceful. Edwina understood the rules. She also began, quietly at first, to resist them. She was restless before the world gave her a reason to be. She wanted movement. She wanted admiration. She wanted escape. She wanted to be chosen in a way that did not feel like another form of arrangement. Then she met Louis Mountbatten, known as Dickie. He was royal, ambitious, handsome, eager, and touched by his own form of family injury. The Mountbatten name itself had been remade from Battenberg during the anti-German feeling of the First World War. Dickie understood what it meant for identity to be edited by public pressure. He was close to royalty, hungry for command, and determined to turn family connection into personal importance. He had charm energy, and a kind of bright devotion that could feel irresistible to a young woman used to emotional distance. Their courtship was full of speed, grief, and glamour. Both had lost important figures. Both were young enough to mistake intensity for certainty. Dickey saw Edwina as dazzling, wealthy, modern, and alive. Edwina saw in him movement, title, romance, and perhaps the promise that marriage could give shape to the emptiness no fortune had filled. When they married in 1922, the world saw a perfect match: the naval royal and the golden heiress. The wedding had every ingredient society loved: uniforms, jewels, aristocratic guests, press attention, and the sense that a new generation of glamour had arrived. But a title can give a woman a place on a seating chart. It cannot give her peace. Marriage made Edwina a Mountbatten, but it did not make her still. Almost immediately, the difference between image and life began to show. Dickey loved order. He loved planning, schedules, technology, naval discipline, coded systems, clean lines, command. Edwina wanted air. He wanted to build a life around duty and shared public assent. She wanted to feel alive in a way that duty could not provide. He was devoted, but devotion can become suffocating when it comes from a person who does not understand the shape of your hunger. Their marriage was not simply a failure, and it was not simply a love story. It became a private treaty between two people trapped inside public roles. Dickey needed glamour, loyalty, connection, and a wife whose fortune and social brilliance could help him move through power. Edwina needed freedom, admiration, tenderness, and room to breathe. Neither could give the other a conventional home, so they built something stranger, a marriage that survived by refusing to behave like one. The world preferred the simpler version. Edwina was scandalous. Edwina was restless. Edwina had lovers. Edwina humiliated her husband. Edwina could not be tamed. There was truth in some of that, but not enough truth to explain her. Her affairs were not only appetite, they were escape routes. In each attachment, she seemed to search for something different: danger, admiration, play, softness, permission, or the simple proof that she still existed outside the Mountbatten name. That does not make every choice harmless. Edwina caused pain. She could be careless with others because she was trying not to feel the emptiness inside herself. She was not a saint misunderstood by gossip. She was flawed, privileged, impulsive, sometimes selfish, sometimes irresponsible. But scandal made the same mistake again and again. It asked whom she loved, but rarely asked what she was trying to escape. Her daughters, Patricia and Pamela, arrived into the same system of nannies, nurseries, travel, and divided attention that had shaped Edwina herself. She loved them, but love did not always become presence. In this, she repeated part of the wound she had inherited. The child who had waited for a mother became a mother others sometimes had to wait for. That is one of the hardest truths in Edwina's life. Pain does not automatically make a person gentle in the places where they were hurt. Sometimes it teaches them to keep moving before anyone can ask them to stay. The public saw the parties. It saw the clothes, the dancing, the motor cars, the yachts, the Mayfair nights, the famous men, the rumors that attached themselves to her like perfume. One of the most damaging scandals involved the singer Leslie Hutchinson, known as Hutch, a black performer whose talent and magnetism made him famous in elite circles. The gossip around Edwina and Hutch carried not only private suspicion, but racial cruelty. A newspaper insinuation became a public wound. The Mountbattens took legal action and won an apology, but the damage showed how quickly admiration could turn punitive when a woman crossed the lines society wanted kept in place. It was never only about fidelity. It was about control. A white, aristocratic woman's closeness to a black entertainer threatened the social imagination of her class more than many of her other affairs. The scandal revealed what society was truly protecting, not morality, but hierarchy. Edwina had embarrassed the codes that allowed elite Britain to pretend it was civilized while keeping its deepest prejudices intact. Still, the scandals did not destroy the marriage. Dickey suffered, adapted, forgave, negotiated, and eventually built his own private freedoms. Their bond changed shape again and again. At times, they seemed more like siblings, allies, co-conspirators, rivals, parents, friends, and public partners than husband and wife in any ordinary sense. Outsiders called it convenience. That was too small. There was convenience, certainly, but also loyalty. There was injury, but also affection. There was distance, but also a strange and durable tenderness. They had stopped expecting marriage to save them. That may be why it survived. Then war came, and Edwina changed. War did what money, marriage, travel, lovers, and society had never managed to do. It gave her a purpose large enough to hold her. At first, not everyone believed she was serious. To committees and officials, Edwina was still a famous woman with a complicated reputation. Too glamorous to be useful, too visible to be practical. Perhaps a patroness looking for a uniform to wear. That judgment underestimated her. Edwina did not want a ceremonial title. She wanted work. Once she found it, something in her settled for the first time. Through St. John Ambulance and the Red Cross world, she discovered that she was good under pressure. This was the great reversal of her life. In peacetime, society judged how she danced, dressed, flirted, failed as a wife, or behaved as a mother. In war, none of that mattered beside a shelter, a stretcher, a ward, a volunteer rota, a supply shortage, a wounded civilian, or a nurse who needed help. In the shelters, no one cared whether she had been faithful. They cared whether she came back with blankets, medicine, transport, staff, and the authority to make officials listen. Edwina's privilege did not disappear when she put on a uniform. It followed her into every room. But what mattered was what she did with it. She used rank as leverage. She used glamour as access. She used her name to force doors open, to shame people into action, to push supplies toward those who had been ignored. She remained a woman of immense privilege. The difference was that she began using privilege not only as escape, but as pressure. During the Blitz, she toured shelters, rest centers, training facilities, hospitals, and first aid posts. She saw overcrowding, confusion, exhaustion, shortages, and the gap between official reassurance and lived reality. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. She remembered details that others tried to bury. She followed up when a less determined visitor would have moved on. Volunteers learned that she might arrive late, tired, glamorous, impatient, and impossible to fool. She missed very little. That presence mattered. Edwina had lacked steady presence as a child. She had struggled to give it as a mother. In war, she gave it to strangers. She appeared in places where people expected abandonment. She walked into basements, shelters, aid stations, and hospitals where fear had become part of the air. She saw people not as symbols of suffering, but as individuals with names, needs, and stories. That was where the woman's society called Scandalous began to become necessary. By the early years of the Second World War, Edwina had taken on serious responsibility within the St. John Ambulance Brigade. She inspected, organized, reported, and pushed. She could be demanding because she had discovered a standard outside aristocratic manners. In this world, a failure was not a social embarrassment. A failure could mean someone did not receive care, equipment, shelter, or attention in time. The work also changed her marriage. Dickie was rising in the war, exposed to danger at sea and later to strategic command. Edwina's war was different, but no less consuming. The two of them, who had spent years failing to fit into domestic expectations, began to respect each other through work. War gave both a stage where their strongest qualities finally made sense. His need for command became useful. Her restlessness became mobility. His ambition found a military purpose. Her hunger to be needed found a human one. When Dickie was appointed Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, Edwina's world expanded again. She did not simply become the wife of a senior commander. She became a witness to the medical and human failures that war left behind. Hospitals, camps, transit points, welfare centers, prisoner recovery systems, refugee needs. The scale was vast, and official routes could only show part of the truth. Edwina wanted the part not shown. That became one of her signatures. She did not trust polished reports. She wanted the ward behind the ward, the train after the inspection, the camp after the officer had explained that everything was under control. This was not charity as performance. This was inspection as confrontation. Edwina went where reports were too clean, where suffering had been made orderly in language, and where the truth was heat, infection, hunger, exhaustion, and delay. After Japan's surrender, Southeast Asia held horrors that polite language could barely contain. Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees emerged from camps broken by hunger, illness, forced labor, fear, and time. Some had survived years of conditions that had stripped ordinary life down to the most basic acts: finding food, enduring sickness, remembering names, staying alive until someone came. Edwina went among them not as a distant symbol, but as a listener. She collected details, messages, requests, complaints, and fragments of lives that needed to be carried back to the world. In places like Rangoon, Singapore, Thailand, and Changi, she encountered men and women for whom rescue was not an abstract victory. It was water, medicine, evacuation, soap, food, cigarettes, transport, and the shock of being addressed as human again. Edwina knew how to use warmth without losing speed. She could make exhausted men laugh. She could comfort without becoming sentimental. She could be blunt in a way that cut through despair. Most importantly, she remembered. To the abandoned, being remembered is not a small thing. These years gave Edwina the kind of authority no ballroom could have given her. It was not moral purity. She was still difficult, still privileged, still capable of blindness. But she had become useful in places where usefulness mattered more than reputation. The woman society once described through lovers and clothes was now walking through the human wreckage of war, forcing systems to respond. Then came India. To be the last viceroy of India was to stand inside a contradiction. Edwina arrived as part of the imperial household, the wife of the last British viceroy, carrying the rituals of an empire that was already ending. She entered rooms built to display British authority at the very moment that authority was being dismantled. The old world wanted her to decorate the end of empire. The crisis forced her to witness what empire had left behind. The Mountbattens arrived in India in 1947. Britain was leaving. Independence was coming. But so was partition. India and Pakistan would be born through one of the largest and most painful upheavals of the 20th century. Political decisions moved through documents, committees, deadlines, borders, and speeches. Human consequences moved through roads, trains, camps, hospitals, villages, and families who suddenly did not know which side of a line they belonged to. Edwina understood power by then, but she also understood that power often hides its cost in other people's bodies. As vicereine, she could have chosen ceremony. She could have softened the optics of departure, arranged receptions, smiled beside Dickie, and performed compassion from a safe distance. Instead, she moved toward welfare work, hospitals, women's organizations, medical groups, social workers, refugees, and the people most likely to disappear inside official history. She met Indian women not as decorative additions to imperial hospitality, but as political and social actors. She listened to reformers, organizers, doctors, and activists. She crossed social lines that British India had spent generations preserving. This did not make her outside empire. That would be too easy. Edwina was not an outsider riding in to rescue the wounded from a system she had nothing to do with. She stood inside the imperial structure. She benefited from its privilege, its houses, its staff, its authority, its access. But from inside that structure, she looked toward the damage and refused to let it remain invisible. That is what makes her story complicated enough to matter. The last vicereine was supposed to soften the end of empire. Edwina did something more dangerous. She looked directly at the human cost of it. Partition stripped ceremony down to its bones. Titles meant little beside women searching for missing children, families walking without maps, men guarding what little they had left, and camps where hunger, disease, and fear moved faster than any government could answer. Violence spread. Trains arrived with terrible stories, roads filled with refugees, communities fractured. Rumor moved as quickly as fire. No single person could stop it. No one should pretend Edwina could have undone the consequences of imperial haste, political breakdown, communal fear, and the brutal momentum of partition. What she did was smaller than rescue and larger than symbolism. She kept arriving. She visited camps, hospitals, shelters, and relief sites. She pushed agencies toward coordination. She chaired, inspected, argued, reported, and carried details from the field back toward rooms of power. She did not save India from partition. That would be false. What she did was insist that suffering remain visible to those who preferred maps, meetings, and policy language. She made human damage harder to ignore. In Delhi and beyond, Edwina's work during the refugee crisis became one of the defining parts of her life. She saw people sleeping in overcrowded compounds, makeshift camps, religious sites, ruins, and public spaces turned into emergency shelters. She saw a disease threaten where sanitation had collapsed. She saw women and children whose losses did not fit easily into government categories. She understood that relief was not simply kindness. It was logistics, authority, medicine, food, clothing, transport, clean water, and speed. Compassion without organization can become another form of helplessness. Edwina had learned that in war. In India, she used it. There was also Gandhi. Gandhi's presence moved her deeply. He represented something the imperial world could not absorb through ceremony: moral authority outside the structures Britain understood. Edwina listened to him with a seriousness that showed how far she had traveled from the girl raised for display. She did not always understand everything around her. She could not. But she had learned to recognize force that did not depend on uniform, title, or wealth. Gandhi carried that force. When he was assassinated in 1948, the grief that followed shook India and everyone close to its transition. Edwina and Dickie were present in that national sorrow, no longer as distant imperial figures, but as witnesses standing inside the crowd of history. And then there was Jawaharlal Nehru. History has often treated Nehru as the great romantic mystery of Edwina's later life. Their letters, their meetings, their emotional intensity, the speculation about whether the relationship became physical, the way each seemed to find in the other a form of refuge. It is easy to understand why the story holds public attention. A British viceroy and India's first prime minister, empire ending, power changing hands, two lonely people at the center of history, writing to each other across borders and duties. The ingredients are irresistible. But if Nehru becomes the whole story, Edwina is diminished again. Nehru did not make Edwina important. By the time she met him, she had already earned authority in hospitals, shelters, war zones, prisoner recovery, refugee relief, and welfare work. He did not create her seriousness. He recognized it. That was the gift. Nehru was brilliant, exhausted, poetic, disciplined, burdened by history and by the loneliness of command. He had spent years in prison, years inside the struggle for independence, years carrying the hopes and contradictions of a country moving toward freedom through pain. Edwina was not merely dazzled by him, she was met by him. With Nehru, she was not only Dickie's wife, not only the rich heiress, not only the woman society had judged, not only the last vice, reign performing grace at the end of empire. She was a mind, a witness, a companion in a broken world. Their relationship has been debated for decades. Some call it romantic. Some call it spiritual. Some call it emotional. Some suspect more. Some insist the physical question matters. But the truth that can be said with care is this: their attachment was deep, intimate, enduring, and central to both of them. Their correspondence carried tenderness, thought, loneliness, political strain, memory, and longing. Whether history can prove everything people suspected is less important than what the relationship clearly gave Edwina. It gave her a form of recognition without possession. That is why Nehru belongs differently in her story than many earlier men. Her earlier affairs often looked like escape routes, from marriage, from boredom, from suffocation, from invisibility, from the fear that she had been loved only as an object of display. With Nehru, the movement was not simply escape. It was arrival. She was not running from herself. She was being met at the point where her real self had finally emerged. The relationship was still dangerous. It existed inside politics, empire, marriage, national memory, and public suspicion. It could never be only private. Nothing around either of them was only private. But Edwina's marriage to Dickie had long since become something strangers could not easily categorize. They had survived affairs, distance, jealousy, public duty, family responsibility, and a strange loyalty that outlasted conventional romance. Dickie knew of Nehru's importance to her, By many accounts, he accepted it with the weary generosity of a man who had learned that love sometimes survives by not demanding ownership. That is not weakness. It is not simplicity. It is the complicated architecture of lives lived under public pressure for too long. After India, Edwina could not simply return to the old world. Mayfair had lost some of its spell. Parties that once promised oxygen now seemed airless. The social habits that had once helped her outrun loneliness could no longer distract her from what she had seen. Bombed cities, injured civilians, exhausted prisoners, refugee camps, partition, disease, hunger, political grief, and the collapse of old certainties. Once a woman has found purpose in the middle of human emergency, drawing rooms can begin to feel like another kind of exile. She continued working. St. John, Red Cross, welfare organizations, hospitals, international tours, inspections, relief missions. She traveled through difficult places, often while unwell, often exhausted, often against advice. Her body began to show the cost of refusing rest. But Edwina had never been good at stillness. As a young woman, she had moved to avoid emptiness. In later life, she moved because there was always another need, another visit, another report, another institution failing someone without enough voice. Her politics also became more outspoken. She criticized colonial assumptions, racial contempt, and bureaucratic cruelty with a frankness that made people in her own circles uncomfortable. A beautiful woman behaving badly could be contained as gossip. A privileged woman using her voice against the prejudices of her class was harder to forgive. Edwina had become inconvenient in a new way. She was no longer only the subject of scandal. She was a witness who had stopped protecting the comfort of people who preferred not to know. This was another form of rebellion, but less glamorous and more dangerous. She was not merely breaking rules of marriage or private desire. She was breaking the rule that a gilded woman should never turn her gaze too sharply on the system that gilded her. In her later years, she and Dickie remained bound by affection, history, family, and mutual understanding. Their marriage had become its own country, with borders no outsider could draw correctly. There were separate lives, shared responsibilities, memories, wounds, jokes, kindnesses, and a loyalty that persisted beyond ordinary explanation. He pursued his career. She pursued her work. They disappointed each other. They protected each other. They had long ago stopped being the young couple beneath the wedding arch. They had become survivors of the image that once promised to define them. Nehru remained central to Edwina's inner life. Their letters continued. Their meetings, when they came, carried the tenderness of people who understood that time was never fully theirs. He was a prime minister. She was still a Mountbatten, still watched, still obligated, still moving between worlds. But in their correspondence, there was a space where titles seemed to loosen. He could be weary. She could be vulnerable. They could speak in the language of people who had seen history from too close a distance and still needed beauty, memory, and the comfort of being understood. For Edwina, this mattered because she had spent so much of her life being misread. As a girl, she was trained to behave. As a debutante, she was priced by fortune. As a wife, she was measured by fidelity. As a mother, she was judged by absence. As a scandal, she was flattened into desire. As a vicereine, she risked being reduced to ceremony. With Nehru, she felt seen as the whole contradiction, restless and serious, privileged and compassionate, damaged and capable, lonely and brave. But being understood does not stop the body from failing. By the late 1950s, Edwina's health was increasingly fragile. There had been illness after illness, exhaustion, infections, pain, warnings from doctors, and the visible toll of a life spent pushing through weakness as if rest were a moral failure. She had been told to slow down. She did not. There were still inspections to make, people to visit, institutions to press, causes to support. Service had saved her from emptiness, but it also demanded everything. In 1960, she traveled to North Borneo on a St. John inspection tour. She was far from the ballrooms where society had first judged her, far from the early marriage scandals, far from the debutante photographs, far from the child who once waited for her mother's return. She was in uniform, working, still pressing on through pain. The symbolism is difficult to ignore because it was not staged. Edwina died in her sleep at Jesselton in British North Borneo. She was 58 years old. The story that followed her death would forever return to Nehru's letters. That detail became part of the legend, and it is easy to see why. It turns her death into an image. The restless woman finally still. The scandalous heiress gone while serving. The last great emotional presence of her life surviving in words. But the detail matters not because it proves a gossip story. It matters because it shows what people understood she had carried close to the end. Not only diamonds, not only invitations, not only the old evidence of being admired, letters, memory. The written proof that someone had seen the woman beneath the rolls. Her body was brought back, and she was buried at sea, as she had wished. The sea suited her better than a closed grave. She had never belonged easily to fixed places. She had moved through houses, ships, countries, hospitals, camps, palaces, and war zones. To be given to the water was, in a strange way, fitting. Nehru sent a wreath of marigolds through the Indian Navy, a final gesture that joined love, grief, history, and farewell. The flowers floated, then moved away. And so Edwina Mountbatten passed into memory, where the old question returned. Was she scandalous? Yes, at times. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. She broke rules, hurt people, neglected duties, and lived with a freedom that others often paid for emotionally. She was careless in ways only the privileged can afford to be. She could be selfish, evasive, and difficult. The gilded life gave her exits that poorer women did not have. Any honest portrait must say that. But scandal alone is too small for her. She was also a child who learned that love could vanish. A girl raised for display who never stopped searching for a place where she could feel real. A young woman whose fortune made her desirable but not secure. A wife inside a marriage that became less a romance than a long negotiation with public roles. A mother who repeated wounds she did not know how to heal. A woman whose lovers were often less about pleasure than escape. A wartime organizer who became more useful than anyone expected. A relief worker who walked into places where suffering had been hidden behind reports. A last viceroy who stood inside empire and still moved toward the people empire had failed. A woman who found in Nehru not the beginning of her importance, but the recognition of the person she had fought to become. That is why Edwina's story belongs to gilded women. Because the gold was real, the privilege was real, the damage was real, the service was real, the contradiction was the truth. The world remembered Edwina Mountbatten for scandal because scandal was easier to understand than a privileged woman who stopped behaving like an ornament. Her real scandal may not have been the lovers, the unconventional marriage, the whispered letters, or the society columns that followed her from Mayfair to Delhi. Her real scandal was that she was born to decorate power and died having walked through the wreckage power left behind. She began as a girl taught to vanish gracefully. She ended as a woman no one could reduce to silence. And that is the story gossip never knew how to tell.